Hey, welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans, for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Sunday, October 27th, 2024, and thank you for joining me as I talk to myself into a microphone about Ohio State's harrowing, nerve-wracking, and highly concerning 21-17 win over unranked Nebraska in the Horseshoe yesterday. That was 3.5 hours of unpleasantness. I felt like I was passing a kidney stone the whole time. We were expecting, or at least hoping, to see an angry, motivated Ohio State team, as Ryan Day would say, leave no doubt about its status as a national title contender with a convincing win over a Nebraska team that was coming off an embarrassing 49-point loss to Indiana. What we were left with instead were an abundance of doubts, first and foremost about the left side of the Ohio State offensive line, specifically left tackle. But secondly, and relatedly, the Buckeye rushing attack, which was limited to 2.1 yards per carry yesterday. And most especially, Ryan Day. I personally came away from yesterday's performance with major doubts about Day's ability to motivate and prepare this team, to problem solve, and to navigate the choppy waters ahead as Ohio State moves toward another matchup game with number 3 Penn State in Happy Valley next Saturday. That is one of 3 remaining games on the regular season schedule that Ohio State could very easily lose if the team I watched yesterday shows up. Indiana and Michigan next month are the other 2. Ohio State could get boat raced in 1 or 2 of those games if the team I watched yesterday shows up. I truly believe that Ryan Day is now coaching for his job, and not in the way that all Ohio State coaches have to coach for their job the minute they take it. He is actually, literally, coaching for his job, in my view. Now, we are all very well aware of the circumstances, but they bear repeating today. Day has had the full weight of Ohio State NIL behind him. Reportedly, $20 million was spent to give him arguably the best roster in college football, and that includes the number 1 prep player in the country, Jeremiah Smith, and the number 1 rated player in the transfer portal, Caleb Downs. Day was given a blank check to hire an expensive coaching staff, which included expensive coordinators in Jim Knowles and his mentor, his boy, Chip Kelly. But right now, Curt Cignetti at Indiana, with a tiny fraction of Ohio State's talent and resources, is coaching fucking circles around Ryan Day. So that is highly concerning. So as I always do on Sundays, I'm going to tick down a short list of observations from yesterday's performance, assuming, of course, that you watched the game. You probably already absorbed a bunch of analysis and opinions on this game already, and I'm going to assume you know what happened. Let's start with the desperate, dire 911 emergency situation at left tackle. As we know, Josh Simmons was lost for the season to a knee injury 2 weeks ago in the Oregon game. Senior Zen Michalski seemed to play well enough in relief of Simmons against the Ducks, even though his PFF grades from that game were awful, to earn the start yesterday against Nebraska. And Michalski was an unmitigated disaster most of the afternoon before eventually leaving the game in the fourth quarter with what looked like a pretty serious lower leg injury of his own. Now, at this point, Michalski's status for the rest of the season is unclear, but I think it's safe to say, regardless of his health, he is not the answer for the Buckeyes at left tackle. Yesterday on Subtext, Doug Lesmerises said, quote, "It's more the coach's fault than the player's fault. I don't think he's good enough to be put in that position, but I think Michalski played one of the worst individual games I've seen by a Buckeye in 20 years, end quote. I mean, that is a brutal assessment from Lesmerises, who's, by the way, has been covering Ohio State football since 2005. Now, I will say, before Michalski went down, let's give the young man a little credit for actually blocking pretty well on Ohio State's fourth quarter scoring drive to retake the lead. He actually held his one-on-one block really well on the touchdown pass from Howard to Judkins, and all of that action on that play actually happened on Michalski's side, and he locked up the defensive end on that play. So let's not bury the kid completely. When it really mattered, he did hold up in pass protection on a crucial play, but On the whole, again, as I said, the performance by Michalski was pretty much an unmitigated disaster for most of the afternoon. Now, Donovan Jackson moved to left tackle and played only 4 snaps there. After retaking the lead late in the fourth quarter, the offense didn't really attempt to do anything other than burn clock. Their penultimate possession of the game went 3 plays for -6 yards with 3 consecutive, very conservative run plays against a heavy box. And then their last possession was 3 kneel downs by Will Howard. So I don't think we can really assess whether Jackson is a legitimate option for them at left tackle. But, since he arrived in Columbus, there has always been some speculation that Jackson would eventually move over to left tackle, even though he doesn't have all the measurables that you would want in a left tackle in terms of height and I think arm length, that sort of thing. But he does have good feet. And look, he might be their only remaining option now. I said on our preview pod on Thursday that I was really concerned about left tackle. I mean, if Justin Fry can't find a serviceable option there, it could be the difference between a deep playoff run and not. That's what I said on Thursday. But at this stage, it might even be the difference between even making the playoff at all. Now, after the game, several Buckeyes were gathered at midfield in prayer while the rest of the team sang Carmen, Ohio. You saw some fan reaction over that on Twitter. But look, if they were praying for a serviceable left tackle, I got no problem with it because that's where we are right now, folks. Light a fucking candle and say a prayer for a decent left tackle to fall from the heavens. And on the whole, look, it was not a great day for the Ohio State offensive line. Michalski finished with a dreadful pass blocking grade of 14.2 according to PFF, but he was not the only one who struggled in pass protection. Tegra Shabola played 38 snaps at right guard. He finished with a pass blocking grade of 36.3. Austin Sareveld replaced Shabola for 10 snaps, and he was even worse. Sareveld finished with a pass blocking grade of 21.2. So left tackle isn't the only issue for Justin Fry, as he still seems to be pretty unsettled at right guard as well. Now, curiously, the run blocking grades for the starting offensive line are much higher than they were in pass blocking. Now, according to PFF, Josh Fryer finished with a run blocking grade of 72.7. Donovan Jackson was at 75.7. Seth McLaughlin was at 66.6. Zen Michalski was at 70.5. And Tegra Shabola was at 55.1. I mean, that's 3 of 5 starters with run blocking grades over 70. Yet, watching the game, it was obvious Ohio State could not run the ball. Only 29 yards on 10 carries for Quinshon Judkins. Only 25 yards on 10 carries for Trey Henderson. The Buckeyes finished with only 64 yards rushing on 31 carries. Now, the interior of the Nebraska defensive line is pretty damn good, and we pointed this out in our preview pod. Nash Hutmacher and Ty Robinson, 2 very good defensive tackles for Nebraska. They had a huge impact yesterday. The Huskers came into this game 16th nationally against the run. So it's not like the Nebraska defensive front is chopped liver, but it's also not the 2000 Baltimore Ravens either. We should expect a lot more from the Ohio State ground game than 64 yards on 31 carries, even with the absences of Josh Simmons and Will Kazmarek, who, by the way, was their best blocking tight end. He was another big loss for them. But still, we should expect more than 64 yards on 31 carries. I don't know if the blame goes to Chip Kelly or maybe even Will Howard for not checking out of certain plays, but the Buckeyes had several failed short yardage situations in this game where they ran out of the pistol into a heavy box. To me, those are situations where you put Will Howard under center and run the brotherly shove, which they did do successfully in one other short yardage situation. I'm personally anxious to hear what Ross Fulton has to say about how Chip Kelly schemed up the running game yesterday. Fulton he's one of the film nerds that I follow on X. He works for Buckeye Huddle. I also wonder how the running game might have been improved with better reads from Will Howard on the zone read. That's another thing I expect to hear from Ross Fulton. It seemed like Howard could have kept the ball on more than one occasion, instead of letting Henderson and Judkins run into the teeth of the Nebraska front. We saw Howard do that effectively on the go-ahead scoring drive late in the game. Howard had a 10-yard run off the zone read to set Ohio State up with a 1st and goal on that drive. I mean, the Buckeyes have to get a better performance from the offensive line to be sure moving forward, but it also seems like Will Howard being a more willing runner out of the zone read is part of that solution. Now, I can only assume the offensive line struggles in pass protection are what led to only 16 pass attempts from Will Howard in this game. Howard was 13 of 16 for 221 yards, 3 touchdown passes, and an interception, but he averaged 13.8 yards per attempt. Jeremiah Smith was only targeted 4 times. You have a weapon like Jeremiah Smith and you only target him 4 times? And Smith, he made the most of his opportunities. He finished the afternoon with 3 catches for 70 yards and then included a 60-yard touchdown reception in the second quarter to put the Buckeyes up 14-3. And look, likewise for Emeka Egbuka, 3 catches for 20 yards on only 5 targets for Egbuka. Smith and Egbuka are the best receiver duo in the country, and they were only targeted 9 times yesterday. Now, Carnell Tate, he finished with perhaps the best game of his career, catching all 4 passes that were thrown his way for 102 yards. That included a 40-yard touchdown catch and a huge 37-yard reception on Ohio State's go-ahead scoring drive in the fourth quarter. Tate made every single one of his receptions count yesterday. Look, the Ohio State receivers, they were awesome. When they got their opportunities. I mean, nobody did more with less than that group. They were just severely underutilized in this game. Had Ohio State lost that game yesterday, man, there would have been huge questions for Ryan Day and Chip Kelly over 16 pass attempts by Will Howard in this game and only 4 targets for Jeremiah Smith. Will Howard did have a few throws float on him, though. He had a couple throws to Egbuka in the second quarter that kind of got away from him, including his third quarter interception. And I guess you couple those throws with the shaky pass protection, maybe that explains why the Ohio State offense turtled up most of the second half. It wasn't until Nebraska took the lead with 10:47 to play that the offense finally was forced out of its shell. The Buckeye offense finished the day with only 285 yards of total offense. They were 1 of 10 on third down, and again, only 2.1 yards per carry in the run game. The play of the offensive line certainly had a hand in those putrid stats, but the coaching and scheme aren't entirely blameless here either. I mean, there's plenty of blame to go around there. And I think there's something between the ears with this team as well that's also to blame. Because when Ohio State absolutely needed the points, they go 75 yards on 8 plays in 4 minutes and 43 seconds. And they even ran it 5 times for 26 yards on that drive when they couldn't run it the rest of the day. When the offense needed to impose its will on the Nebraska defense, they did it, both on the ground and through the air. So if you're looking for a ray of hope for the Ohio State offense moving forward, there it is right there. 8 plays, 75 yards, 4 minutes and 43 seconds, and they did it on the ground and through the air. But where was that sense of urgency during the first 3 quarters of this game? That's what Ryan Day and Chip Kelly need to figure out before next Saturday's trip to Happy Valley. Both Doug Lesmerises and Bill Landis said in the postgame that Ohio State probably loses to 20 to 30 other teams with the way it played yesterday, and that includes the defense, which did a lot of good things, but was also fortunate they were facing a true freshman quarterback who missed a few big throws down the stretch. And look, he just wasn't ready for the moment. I think we can say that. Now, in our pregame pod, Paige and I talked about how it was critical that Jim Knowles figure out how to get more impactful pressure on opposing quarterbacks. And at least for one game, I thought the Buckeye defense did that pretty well yesterday. Jim Knowles dialed up a lot more pressures, or it seemed as though he did, than he did against Oregon. We saw a lot more twisting and stunting from the defensive line in this game. The defense sacked Dylan Raiola 3 times. They finished with 13 tackles for loss. And Jordan Hancock did turn in a game-sealing interception of Raiola with 1:16 to play. For the second straight game, also, the defense came up with a huge red zone stop in the third quarter after a Will Howard interception set Nebraska up 1st and goal at the Ohio State 7-yard line. Cody Simon and Davison Igbinosun stuffed Dante Dowdell on 4th down from the Ohio State 2-yard line to end that scoring threat. Again, let's not forget the Buckeyes did that same thing to the Oregon offense in the third quarter of that game. Ohio State is now 8th nationally in opponent red zone touchdown percentage. They are very good in the red zone, and that's not nothing. You have to consider that when you're talking about this Ohio State defense. I thought Cody Simon was excellent yesterday. He finished as Ohio State's leading tackler with 8, and that included 3 tackles for loss, 2 of which came on Nebraska's final possession. And of course, Simon was responsible for the 4th and goal stop on Dante Dowdell. I think it might have been Cody Simon's best game of his career. I thought Caleb Downs was also outstanding in this game. He made several tackles in the open field that would have gone for big gainers, potentially even touchdowns. Downs is the consummate eraser on the back end for this defense. He is so valuable to what they want to do, and he's been worth every penny of that NIL money. And look, with Lathan Ransom unavailable, Jordan Hancock played 44 snaps at safety and finished as the defense's highest graded defender according to PFF with a grade of 76.1. Hancock finished with 5 tackles, the game-sealing interception, and a forced fumble. Now, Nebraska was able to fall on that fumble, but he was huge in this game, filling in for Ransom, who, by the way, just continues to be dogged by injuries in his career. Ryan Day said Ransom is day-to-day with a lower leg injury. Ransom was seen in the pregame walking without a boot or crutches, but with a noticeable limp. I don't know. We might have to get used to Jordan Hancock at safety for the foreseeable future. And look, I'm okay with that. So those are all the positives for the defense. Now, on the flip side, I thought Davison Igbinosun was fucking unplayable yesterday. He was flagged for 3 pass interference penalties, and I don't think Denzel Burke covered particularly well either. Nebraska seemed unafraid to throw at both of them. On Nebraska's only touchdown drive of the game, Raiola went right at Denzel Burke on 3rd and 7 from the Ohio State 8-yard line. Burke stumbled on the play and was beaten by Isaiah Nair for the reception, which set Nebraska up 1st and goal at the Ohio State 1-yard line. The play was initially ruled a touchdown, but on review, Nair was ruled down at the 1-yard line. Dante Dowdell would score on the next play. Burke was also beaten by Nair for a 30-yard reception in the first quarter that, lucky for him, was overturned by replay. It was ruled that Nair trapped the ball. And both Burke and Igbinosun were bailed out by offensive pass interference penalties on Nebraska receivers in this game. Now, Bill Landis pointed it out in his post-game column. Opposing quarterbacks these last 2 games have not been afraid to go right at Burke and Igbinosun, and that is problematic because opposing quarterbacks know there's a better than 50% chance Igbinosun is going to commit a penalty. And Burke he's just getting beat off the line of scrimmage. And it also seems like he's having trouble finding the football and playing the ball. I think it's time to see what Jermaine Matthews can give them at corner. I've personally seen enough of Davis and Igbinosun. They just have to get better in coverage at cornerback. I mean, this is supposed to have been a strength for this defense. They were widely regarded as the best secondary in the country, and they have not been that. They've been far from that at cornerback so far this season. Now, the Nebraska offense came into this game 98th nationally in rushing offense and 95th in yards per rushing attempt. For the most part, I thought the Ohio State defense did what it needed to do against that limited Nebraska ground game, but there were a couple of bad run fits, misalignments by the defense in the second half that allowed the Huskers to spring a couple of long runs. There was a 19-yarder by Dowdell and a 14-yarder by Emmett Johnson. And then, of course, Dylan Raiola got loose for a 38-yard scramble in the second quarter. I thought Raiola's scrambles actually helped keep Nebraska in this game early. He had several other runs to keep the chains moving for Nebraska in the first half. And I think that's something to pay attention to looking ahead to next week against Penn State, especially if Bo Prabula is the starter at quarterback for Penn State. Now, more on that in a minute. The play of the corners and those couple of bad run fits notwithstanding, I thought on the whole the defense played well in this game. Look, I mean, they held Nebraska to 273 total yards of offense, only 4.1 yards per play, 13 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, a huge 4th and goal stop in the third quarter, and of course, the game-ending interception. They are the reason Ohio State squeaked out this game yesterday. So the Buckeyes survive and advance, so to speak, but concerns abound as Ryan Day heads into another matchup game against a top 4 opponent in Penn State. We don't know what's going to happen at left tackle with Abdul Carter and that Penn State pass rush looming. Can Ohio State find some semblance of a running game that is now plummeted to 35th nationally after being a top 10 rushing offense for much of the season? and there are major questions about whether this coaching staff can find those extra inches in the margins to win what will almost assuredly be a 4-quarter game against a top 3 opponent that will likely come down to the final minute. Now, Penn State has some questions of their own heading into this matchup. Starting quarterback Drew Aller appeared to suffer a knee injury at the end of the first half last night in Penn State's 28-13 win over Wisconsin. That injury was serious enough to keep Aller out of the second half of a very tight ball game. Penn State was actually trailing 10-7 at the half. They took a slim 14-13 lead into the fourth quarter. Backup Bo Pribula relieved Aller and actually played pretty well. Pribula was 11 of 13 for 98 yards passing and 1 touchdown pass. He ran for 28 yards on 6 carries. I'm not sure what Pribula can give them in the vertical passing game, but he seems plenty capable at short to intermediate throws. And to me, he looks like a dynamic running threat from the quarterback position. And if we're thinking about the success that Dylan Raiola had in the first half as a runner against Ohio State yesterday, that's something to consider next Saturday if Pribula does turn out to be the man at quarterback for James Franklin. Now, Penn State also had another notable injury last night in defensive end Dennis Sutton, who appeared to have injured his groin. Dennis Sutton was limited to 26 snaps against Wisconsin. If Dennis Sutton is out, or at least limited next Saturday, that could be a huge break for a struggling Ohio State offensive line, so that's another thing to watch. I'm going to have a lot more to say about this game when Paige, Chad, and I have a much closer look at Penn State this coming Thursday. I think that's going to do it for me for now. Check your feeds for a Penn State preview on Thursday evening. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.